The video was already playing when Rowan Hale entered the conference room. His voice, his silence. The pregnant woman he'd ignored at Long Beach, captured from angles he didn't know existed. But what came next destroyed everything he thought he controlled. The trust that owned the venue, the recording rights, the 3 projects he'd been presenting as his own had belonged to someone else for 18 months. 18 months of observation while he calculated how little his silence would cost. The pregnant woman he'd abandoned before 200 witnesses? Alara Whitcomb, Billionaire's daughter. She'd owned his entire professional foundation before he decided defending her wasn't worth the risk. Drop a comment where you're watching from and subscribe before someone you underestimate becomes the authority you answer to. Because Rowan is about to discover how many ways power can dismantle a life when you choose silence at the wrong moment. Alara Whitcomb's hand found the back of the empty chair before her knees did, steadying herself as the woman with the microphone didn't pause when she spoke, which is how everyone in the room understood that the remark was intentional. 6 months pregnant, and standing near the aisle on the mezzanine level of the Civic Exchange Center in Long Beach, where the annual Port Logistics Summit had reached the stage reserved for donor acknowledgments. Alara felt the crowd's attention recalibrate around her as Calla Mercer angled her body slightly toward her and said, with practiced lightness, that if guests were going to wander into staff lanes, they should at least be prepared to clean up after themselves. A few people laughed, not because it was funny, but because the room had already absorbed the hierarchy and laughter was safer than uncertainty. The carpet held the smell of industrial cleaner layered over salt from the harbor outside, and the afternoon light coming through the west-facing windows made the dust visible in the air between them. She wore a neutral dress chosen for travel rather than display, and flats because the swelling in her feet made anything else impractical. A few feet away stood her husband, Rowan Hale, staring at the floor with the strained focus of someone trying to disappear without leaving. Calla lowered her gaze just long enough to make sure Alara felt seen, then gestured toward a small spill near the podium and added that someone should take care of it before it stained the carpet. What had not happened in that moment was as telling as what did. Rowan did not step forward. He did not speak. He shifted his weight and glanced toward Calla, then toward the program director, calculating how much damage silence might cause and deciding, incorrectly, that it would be minimal. Subscribe before silence becomes permission. Around them, conversation resumed in slightly altered tones, the way it does when a line has been crossed but not acknowledged, and the event moved on as though the incident was awkward, uncomfortable, and complete. Alara did not bend down. She looked at Rowan instead, waiting long enough for the choice to become obvious to anyone paying attention, then stepped back into the aisle and let the program continue. Her hand remained on the chair for one more second than necessary, not because she needed the support, but because she was deciding something, and the room could feel it even if no one understood what it was yet. The program director stepped forward with the efficiency of someone trained to smooth over disruptions, thanking donors whose names blurred together in a rhythm that suggested the list had been recited before, and the room settled back into the performance of normalcy with the kind of collective agreement that makes uncomfortable moments disappear faster than they should. Rowan moved first, not toward Alara but toward the refreshment table near the far wall, where he stood with his back to the room and picked up a glass of water he did not drink. His phone appeared in his hand within seconds, thumb scrolling through messages that may or may not have required immediate attention, and the posture he adopted was one Alara had seen before, the carefully constructed invisibility of someone hoping a situation would resolve itself through his absence from it. Alara watched him from her position near the aisle, hand still resting on the chair back, and understood with the clarity that comes from pattern recognition rather than surprise that he would not look at her until enough time had passed for the moment to be reframed as minor. Around them, the summit continued through agenda items and acknowledgments, voices rising and falling in practiced cadence, and she felt the room's attention slide away from her the way water slides off surfaces it cannot penetrate. Calla remained at the podium, laughing at something the program director said, her ease so complete it erased the incident as effectively as an apology might have, and several people in the front rows leaned toward each other with whispered commentary that never includes the person being discussed. What Alara noticed in those minutes was not what was said, but what was left unaddressed, The way the spill near the podium remained untouched until a facilities worker appeared and dealt with it without fanfare. The way Rowan's distance from her became something the room accepted as natural. The way Callah's glance in her direction carried no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but rather the faint satisfaction of someone who had tested a boundary and found it undefended. Subscribe before you miss the warning signs everyone else ignored. The air in the mezzanine had grown warmer as the afternoon stretched on, and through the west-facing windows, she could see the container cranes at the port of Long Beach moving against the skyline with mechanical precision, indifferent to the small humiliations unfolding nearby. Alara stepped away from the chair and moved toward the exit, not quickly enough to signal distress, but deliberately enough that anyone watching would understand she was choosing to leave. She did not look for Rowan as she passed the refreshment table, and he did not call after her. Alara sat in her car in the lower parking level beneath the Civic Exchange Center, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. The concrete walls absorbed sound in a way that made the space feel separate from the event still unfolding 3 floors above, and through the small rectangular windows near the ceiling, she could see the shoes of people passing on the sidewalk outside. Her phone sat in the cup holder, screen dark, and she looked at it for several seconds before picking it up and making the call she had been preparing to make since Callah's voice had carried across the mezzanine with that particular tone of dismissal. The voice that answered was measured in a way that suggested the person on the other end had been expecting the call. Alara did not waste words on preamble, asking only whether the transfer had been completed as filed, and the response came back with the kind of certainty that only legal documentation can provide. Yes, 3 days prior. Timing had been exact. She nodded to herself and asked a second question about authorization windows and whether any delays had been flagged at the county level. No delays. No flags. Everything had moved through the system with the efficiency that significant resources and advanced preparation tend to produce. She ended the call without pleasantries and sat for a moment longer in the gray light of the parking structure, feeling the baby shift position inside her, a reminder that whatever decisions were being made now would shape circumstances she could not yet imagine. Subscribe before the patterns you ignore become the life you inherit. Through the windshield, she could see the oil-stained concrete and painted lines dividing the parking spaces, and somewhere above her Rowan was likely still at the refreshment table, still scrolling through his phone, still calculating how long he needed to stay before he could leave. What Alara had not told him, and would not tell him until the moment when the information would matter most, was that the trust structure he believed belonged to his professional network had shifted ownership in ways that would become visible only when specific conditions were met. The paperwork had been filed in San Jose, executed through channels he did not monitor, and the entities he had been presenting to counsels and investors for the past 8 months answered to different authority than he understood. She had not concealed her identity to deceive him, but to live without the weight of assumption. And what she had learned was that when leverage disappears, character reveals itself in the space where performance used to be. She started the engine and pulled out of the parking structure into the late afternoon traffic on Ocean Boulevard, heading east toward the 710 freeway, and did not look back at the building where her husband was still avoiding the question of what kind of man stays silent when silence costs someone else their dignity. Rowan arrived at their rental house in Seal Beach 2 hours after Alara did, parking his car in the narrow driveway with the kind of precision that suggested he had used the drive time to compose himself. She heard the door open and close, heard his keys land in the ceramic bowl on the entry table, heard the refrigerator open and a bottle being uncapped, and she remained where she was in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with her shoes off and her phone face down beside her. When he appeared in the doorway, he looked at her with the expression of someone prepared to discuss logistics rather than consequence, and his first words confirmed what she had already understood about the conversation he had decided to have. He needed to drive east in the morning, he said, standing in the doorway rather than entering the room. Riverside County. Meetings that had been scheduled for weeks couldn't be postponed, back late the following day. His tone carried the rehearsed quality of someone who had prepared the explanation during the drive. He did not mention Callah. He did not mention the summit. He did not ask whether Alara was all right or acknowledge that anything requiring acknowledgement had occurred. The evening light coming through the bedroom window made his face half visible and half shadow, and she watched him the way someone might watch weather approaching from a distance. with interest but without surprise. She asked which project the Riverside meetings concerned, and he answered with details that may or may not have been accurate, mentioning development timelines and investor concerns that sounded plausible in the way carefully constructed explanations always do. Subscribe before avoidance becomes your relationship's primary language. She nodded as though satisfied, and he seemed to take this as permission to continue, adding that hotel charges would go through the usual channels and he'd call when he was on his way back. The usual channels. She noted the phrase without responding, understanding that mechanisms he believed routine had been shifting beneath him while he attended to more immediate concerns. That night, Rowan packed an overnight bag with methodical attention, and in the morning he left before sunrise. Alara stood at the living room window and watched his car back out and turn south toward the Pacific Coast Highway, which would take him to the 405 and then east toward Riverside County. She did not wave. She did not feel anger, which would have implied his choices still had the power to surprise her. What she felt instead was the settling of certainty, the way a foundation settles after construction, not with drama, but with small adjustments that indicate everything is now bearing the weight it was designed to bear. The baby kicked once, hard enough that she placed her hand over the spot before turning away from the window and reaching for her phone to make the second call that would need to be made before the day ended. Rowan arrived at the office park in Redwood City on a Thursday morning that felt indistinguishable from a dozen other mornings spent in similar buildings, parking structures with assigned visitor spaces and lobbies with minimalist furniture. Calla sat beside him in the car, scrolling through notes on her tablet with visible irritation, and neither of them noticed that the building's directory listed the suite number under a management company neither had heard of. The elevator took them to the third floor, where the hallway smelled like new carpet, and when they entered the conference room they expected to see the usual faces from the development lenders review team. What they saw instead were two people neither recognized, sitting at the far end of a table that could have seated 12, with a screen mounted on the wall behind them already displaying a paused video frame that Rowan understood immediately. The woman on the left introduced herself and her colleague as representatives of ownership, speaking with measured authority that suggested she had delivered similar introductions before. Calla set her tablet down on the table with more force than necessary and asked who had authorized the meeting, and the man on the right answered simply that authorization was not required, that the property they had come to discuss, along with the venue where last week's summit had taken place, and the recording rights to everything that occurred there, belonged to the same trust. The screen came to life without anyone appearing to touch a remote, and the footage was clean, the angles unobstructed, the audio unmistakable. Calla's voice filled the conference room with the same practiced lightness it had carried in Long Beach, angling toward the pregnant woman standing near the aisle, suggesting that guests who wandered into staff lanes should be prepared to clean up after themselves. Subscribe before authority you didn't see coming becomes authority you can't ignore. The video continued for 30 seconds, capturing not just Calla's remarks, but Rowan's silence, the way he had shifted his weight and looked at the floor. When the screen went dark, the woman on the left stated without emphasis that the transfer of controlling interest had been completed 3 days before the Long Beach event, executed through filings in San Jose that had moved through Santa Clara County's recording system with the efficiency that significant resources and advanced preparation produce. Rowan asked who owned the trust, and the answer came back with the specificity of legal documentation. The beneficial owner had maintained that position for 18 months, long enough to observe patterns of behavior under conditions where leverage was assumed rather than verified. The entities Rowan had been presenting to counsels and investors, the developments he had positioned as his professional foundation, answered to authority that had been in place before he understood there was authority to answer to. Calla's face had gone pale, and Rowan's hand on the table had tightened into a fist he did not seem to realize he was making. The woman on the left thanked them for their time and suggested they review documentation that would be sent to their counsel, and the meeting ended with procedural efficiency that made clear there was nothing left to negotiate. Alara sat in her car on a turnout above Muir Beach, where the road curved along the hillside and offered a view of the Pacific that stretched uninterrupted to the horizon. She had driven north from Seal Beach that morning, taking the 101 through San Francisco and across the Golden Gate Bridge before following the coastal highway into Marin County. The engine was off, Windows cracked just enough to let in the salt air and the distant sound of waves breaking against rocks below, and her hand rested on her belly where the baby had been moving for the past 20 minutes with insistent rhythm that made sleep impossible. She allowed herself 30 seconds of something close to grief, not for what was ending, but for what had never been what she had hoped. The pregnancy had been planned, and somewhere before Long Beach, she had convinced herself that the version of Rowan she wanted to see was the version that existed. The baby kicked again, harder, and she felt the movement against her palm and understood that whatever choices were being made now would shape the life that had no say in the circumstances it would inherit. Subscribe before the choices you avoid become the future someone else has to live with. She closed her eyes and let the sound of the ocean fill the space where words would have been, and then she reached for her phone and made the call. The voice that answered belonged to Thaddeus Whitcomb. Alara did not waste time on context, asking only whether he wanted her to halt the transfer, to pull back before the visibility became public, to let Rowan continue operating under assumptions that would remain unchallenged if she chose to protect him from consequences he had earned. Her father's response came without hesitation. The question was not what he wanted, but what she wanted, and he would support whichever direction she chose with the full weight of resources prepared for either outcome. She looked out at the water, at the container ships moving south toward Oakland, and said that she wanted it completed exactly as filed. No delays, no modifications. She wanted the council meeting in Pasadena to proceed as scheduled, and she wanted to be there when the information became visible in ways that could not be reframed or softened. Her father acknowledged this with the brevity of someone who understood that the decision had been made before the call began, and the conversation ended with the efficiency that family business sometimes requires when personal feelings must be separated from structural outcomes. The first meeting that should have happened, but didn't, was scheduled for Tuesday morning in Newport Beach, a quarterly review with a private equity group that had funded two of the projects Rowan had been describing as his portfolio's foundation. The cancellation came via email at 6 in the morning, brief and procedurally polite, citing scheduling conflicts that would be addressed at a later unspecified date. Rowan read the message 3 times in the hotel room, where he had spent the night after leaving the Redwood City meeting, trying to determine whether the language contained information beyond its surface meaning. And by the third reading, he understood that the conflict being referenced had nothing to do with calendars. The second meeting went forward as scheduled, but ended 12 minutes after it began, which Rowan understood was worse than cancellation because it meant someone had decided that maintaining appearances required showing up but not continuing. The development consultant who had invited him to present at the Orange County Planning Forum listened to his opening remarks with attention that suggested she was counting down to an agreed-upon stopping point, and when that point arrived, she thanked him for his time with phrasing that made clear his time was the only thing she wanted. Rowan's phone stayed in his hand during the drive back north on the 405, checking for messages that might explain what was happening, and the absence of those messages told him more than their presence would have. By Thursday, the erosion had become visible enough that pretending not to notice required effort he no longer had. Conference calls confirmed the previous week were moved without explanation, emails that should have received responses within hours went unanswered for days, and the tone of the few messages that did arrive carried a formality that had not been there before. Subscribe before the systems you depend on disappear without explanation. Calla stopped returning his calls after Wednesday, which meant she had either received clearer information or had decided that aligning with uncertainty was a risk her position could not afford, and Rowan found himself driving past her apartment in Irvine twice in the same evening before recognizing that the behavior would not produce the reassurance he was looking for. The notification about the Pasadena Development Council meeting arrived Friday afternoon, and it was the only correspondence that week that did not feel like withdrawal. The session was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and Rowan's presentation slot remained confirmed, which struck him as either an oversight or an indication that whatever was collapsing around him had not yet reached the council level where decisions about long-term projects were still being made. He spent the weekend revising slides that probably did not need revision, rehearsing talking points that probably would not be challenged, and trying to convince himself that one successful presentation could re-establish credibility that he was only now beginning to understand had been borrowed rather than earned. The Regional Development Council met in a conference room on the second floor of Pasadena City Hall, where the windows faced north toward the San Gabriel Mountains. Rowan arrived 15 minutes early and set up his presentation materials with methodical attention that felt like control, even when control had become an illusion. The council members filtered in with casual efficiency, and by the time the session was called to order, there were 11 people in the room, not counting Rowan. The door opened again 12 minutes into the proceedings, and the council aide who entered was guiding someone Rowan recognized before his mind had fully processed why recognition should carry such weight. Alara moved slowly, visibly pregnant at 7 months, and she was directed to a seat at the front that had been left empty in a way that suggested the space had been reserved. The council chair paused mid-sentence and adjusted his posture in the way people do when authority enters a room. He recognized her with formality that preceded introduction, nodding once before continuing with the agenda in a tone that had shifted from procedural to attentive. Rowan's presentation slot arrived on schedule, and he stood and began speaking with rehearsed clarity, walking through development timelines and regulatory milestones and financial structures that he had been positioning as evidence of progress worth continued support. He made it through 4 slides before the council chair interrupted him with gentle redirection that suggests the speaker has misunderstood something fundamental. Subscribe before you realize too late that the room was never yours. The chair indicated that perhaps it would be useful to hear from the representative of the trust that held controlling interest in the projects being discussed, and Rowan felt his face go warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Alara stood with careful movements of someone carrying weight that required consideration, and when she spoke, her voice carried measured authority. She introduced herself using her full legal name, Alara Whitcomb, and stated without emphasis that she held controlling interest in the Whitcomb Family Trust, which had underwritten 3 of the council's active development projects, including the 2 Rowan had just presented as his own. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when information is being processed faster by some people than others, and Rowan remained standing near his presentation materials because sitting down would have required a decision, and decision-making had become temporarily unavailable to him. She described the trust's acquisition timeline in factual sequence, each detail landing with the weight of documentation. 18 months of observation. Transfer completed before the Long Beach summit. Entities that answered to authority Rowan had not known existed. When she turned to face him directly, her expression held no anger, no satisfaction, only clarity itself. She said that she had not concealed her identity to deceive him, but to live without the weight of inherited leverage, and that the leverage he had assumed defined their relationship had never existed outside his own construction. Rowan tried to speak and found that his throat had closed in the way it does when the body understands something the mind has not yet accepted. Someone at the table asked a procedural question about transition timelines, and Alara answered it with specificity that suggested she had anticipated every question the council might ask, and Rowan understood with absolute certainty that he was not going to leave this room with his position intact. The meeting in Pasadena ended with the procedural efficiency that institutional settings produce when decisions have already been made. The council thanked Rowan for his presentation and moved to the next agenda item without discussion, which was how everyone understood that his involvement had been addressed and resolved without requiring explicit statement. He gathered his materials and left through the same door he had entered, and no one stopped him or asked him to stay, and the silence that followed him out was more definitive than any formal termination letter could have been. By the end of that week, the structural changes had become visible in ways that required no announcement because the absence of his name from email chains and meeting invitations communicated everything. The projects he had been presenting continued without interruption, which meant that whatever role he had been playing was not essential to their completion, and the councils and investors who had been receiving his updates began receiving them from different sources. Rowan's phone stopped producing the kind of calls that build careers and started producing the kind that acknowledged transitions, brief conversations with colleagues who wished him well in whatever came next and did not ask what that might be. Kala left Los Angeles within 2 weeks, accepting a position in Phoenix that she described as a strategic career move rather than an exit, and Rowan learned about her departure through a mutual contact rather than from her directly. Subscribe before you become someone people describe in past tense. The apartment in Irvine was vacated quietly, the forwarding address filed through channels that did not include him, and he understood that she had calculated her proximity to consequences and decided that distance was the only reasonable response to instability she had not created. Alara did not contact him, did not pursue further action, did not make statements or demands or requests for acknowledgement. The trust continued its operations with the same procedural efficiency it had maintained before the Pasadena meeting, and Rowan's name simply stopped appearing in the documentation that governed the projects he had once presented as evidence of his professional foundation. There was no additional confrontation because confrontation would have implied that something remained unresolved, and what Alara had made clear in Pasadena was that resolution had occurred 18 months earlier when the trust had acquired controlling interest and observation had replaced assumption as the basis for understanding what kind of marriage they had been living in. What remained for Rowan was not anger or vindication or clarity, but the particular emptiness that comes from recognizing that the story you thought you were in had ended without your participation in its conclusion, and that the person you had assumed needed your protection had never needed anything from you except the honesty you had been unwilling to provide when it mattered. Alara divided her time between Sonoma County and King County, Washington, preparing for a child whose inheritance would be defined less by wealth than by the knowledge of how quietly power can move when it is already in place. The house in Healdsburg sat on 12 acres of hillside vineyard that produced Cabernet Sauvignon, and the property in Bellingham overlooked the bay where ferries crossed toward the San Juan Islands. The pregnancy had reached its final weeks, and her body had become something she negotiated rather than controlled. And in the slowness that late pregnancy imposed, she found herself thinking not about justice or vindication, but about whether Rowan had ever understood what he had walked away from when he chose silence in Long Beach. The baby moved constantly now, shifting position with restless energy that suggested impatience with confinement, and Alara sat in the upstairs room of the Healdsburg house, where the afternoon light came through west-facing windows and felt each movement as both promise and responsibility. She had not spoken to Rowan since Pasadena, and the silence between them had settled into something permanent that required no documentation. What remained unresolved was not whether consequences had been appropriate, but whether he had ever recognized that the moment he chose not to speak was the moment the story he thought he was in ended and another, already underway, continued without him. The trust would pass to the child with the same procedural efficiency that had governed its operations for 18 months, and the entities that had answered to Alara's authority would continue under terms that prioritized long-term stability over short-term advantage, the same principles that had shaped every decision since the transfer. Subscribe before the patterns that define you become the legacy someone else has to explain. Alara had prepared documentation that would allow the child to understand, when understanding became possible, that power had been available but leverage had been refused, and that the difference between those two things was the difference between control and dignity. In the evenings, when the light faded and the vineyard below the house became visible only as dark shapes against darker hillside, Alara walked the property with her hand on her belly and considered the unresolved question that would follow her longer than any satisfaction might have. Did Rowan regret the silence? Or did he regret only its consequences? And if recognition came now, after structure had replaced relationship and distance had become the only honest space between them, did that recognition matter to anyone except the person finally experiencing it? The baby kicked once, hard enough to make her pause mid-step, and she stood there on the gravel path with the smell of turned earth and ripening grapes in the air, and understood that some questions do not have answers that satisfy, and that the work ahead was raising a child who would understand this without needing to learn it through silence the way she had.